Today's episode is proudly sponsored by the Rising Tide Mastermind. The Rising Tide Mastermind is one of my favorite things that I look forward to each and every week because I get to see people that have my best interest in mind. I know this because I have their best interest in mind. And when you get people together in a room like that, you can just imagine how people want to help other people. If this sounds like something you want to learn more about, go to scalinguph2o.com/mastermind. Welcome to the Scaling Up H2O podcast, the podcast where we scale up on knowledge so we don't scale up our systems. I'm Trace Blackmore, the host of the Scaling Up H2O podcast. And Nation, today is the day. This is one of my favorite shows. Yes, you have tuned in on a Pinks and Blues episode. And of course, that is where you don't have a guest today. You just have me. Hopefully that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing because I get to talk with you the entire episode. And how I get that information for what I'm going to talk about is from Scaling Up Nation members just like you that let me know what questions you have that you want answered on this podcast. And I am so grateful that there are so many listeners out there that do that because that allows me to have a show like this today. And we're going to have a great time together, but I want to make sure you know about some things that are going on in our industry so you can make proper plans to attend the ones that are appropriate to you. The first one I'm going to talk about is Aquatech China. That's taking place December 11th through 13th, and that's put on by the International Water Association and the Water Quality Association. And this is a trade show that is focused all on water. We're going to have all the information for you about this show on our events page. And you can get there by going to scalinguph2o.com/events or simply navigating over to our events section. That's where we have everything that we know about on that calendar. And you will also find, if you go there, the 2025 Wastewater Administrators Conference. That's January 23rd through 24th. And that is taking place in Frankenmuth, Michigan. And this one all is about insights, networking opportunities, and cutting-edge solutions all around wastewater. So we're going to have all of that information for you on our events page. If you're in San Diego, California, January 27th through 29th, check out the Clean Tech Forum North America. And this is 3 days of high-quality meetings and deal-making. Learn from analysts and from each other about trends and innovations driving ecosystems forward. This will include investors, corporations, innovators, and everybody in between. So we're going to have all of that information for you on our events page as well. And then the Water for Texas 2025 conference taking place in Austin, Texas. I love Austin, Texas. That is a fun city. That's being held January 27th through January 29th. And this is where industry experts, influencers, innovators, and leaders all gather to discuss water issues impacting us now and for years to come. We'll have all information for you on that in our events page. Now, if you have not been to our events page, I urge you to do that because not only is it going to have the events that we talked about today, it is also going to have things that we did not talk about because we have so many things that we do know that is happening in our water treatment community. We just simply can't talk about all of them on this podcast. So if you have not made going to that page part of your regular routine, you probably want to do that. And I would highly recommend, since we are approaching the end of the year, that you start planning next year. And a really good way to start planning is to open up scalinguph2o.com/events and pick out some of the conferences that you want to attend, and then block that time so you can attend those. Because when you go to a conference, not only are you going to expand your knowledge, you are going to meet people. And folks, this industry is all about the people that you know, the people that you can help, the people that can help you. And the more people you can know, just imagine how much more you can do. And I think that all starts with you getting out there and introducing yourselves, perhaps at the next conference that you attend. Well, Nation, as I mentioned at the top of the show, this is one of my favorite shows. I call it Pinks and Blues. And I know some of the older people in the industry know exactly what pinks and blues are. I don't know if that's a term that's used that much anymore. So I will explain where I first heard it. My father used to call running his tests pinks and blues. And if you think of the hardness test goes from a pink to a blue when you've titrated all of the hardness out of it. So that's where that term comes from. He used to also call it Betty Crockering, like you were baking a cake out of your test kit. Anyway, that was just my dad. And my dad instilled upon me that you do not make any money out of your test kit. Sure, you keep some service requirements done out of your test kit. You keep some commitments that are completed out of your test kit. However, you do not make any money working out of your test kit. So he instilled upon me that the tests were a vital part of a water treater's arsenal. But if you were spending a second longer than what you needed to in your test kit, well, folks, you're never going to get that second back. So I want you to have that mindset as we are talking about probably 12 different questions that I have mashed all up together and created this episode. Now, a lot of times I will either play somebody's voice asking a question, or I will say, this is a question from a specific audience member. I didn't do that today. I just kept answering questions in how I was developing this show. So listen, you might hear your question answered, even though I did not specifically call out your name during this episode. Now, the other mindset I want you to get in is I'm sure you all know how to run your test. So I want you to get in the mindset that when you test, you are simply testing to confirm or deny what you already think you know about the system. Now, with that, that means that the last thing you're going to do when you go into an account is run your tests. Now, most of us, that's the first thing that we do. I'm going to say, I don't have any business running tests until I walk around, see what's going on, talk to people, and have a clear hypothesis of what I think is going on with the system. And then I'm going to use my test to either confirm or disprove that hypothesis. So, hypothesis first, tests last. And when we're talking about first and last, a lot of us just start running tests at random out of our test kit. Or maybe we learned our test in a certain order, but we don't know the rhyme or reason behind that order. Maybe there isn't a rhyme or reason about that order. So here's what I want you to start doing. Your tests are going to be run in the order of how long do they take. So the longest test first to the shortest tests. And while the long ones are developing or baking, as my dad would say, which is why he used to call it Betty Crockering, we would then run our shorter tests. So when I'm waiting for a long silica test, I might be running some shorter tests, and I might also be doing some titrations. So we always want to make sure that our tests are waiting on us. We are not waiting on them because, as my dad said, we're never going to get that time back. Now, also with that being said, you need to understand your tests, because I can't let my test hold indefinitely because there is a holding time, which means that it might take 3 minutes to develop, and then I have to test it within 1 minute. Well, I need to make sure that whatever I am doing, I'm able to test it within that 1 minute after it's ready. Otherwise, I'm not getting a real result. So if you have not done this, I want you to pull out your procedures. And I will tell you, one of my favorite books, it's a free book, the Hach Water Analysis Handbook. We'll have a link to that on our show notes page. It has all of the procedures. I know most of us use Hach. If you don't, most of the procedures are pretty similar, but call out to whoever you are getting your tests from and get those procedures and just put them in order from longest to shortest. A lot of us don't even think about that. So now that we're looking at our tests from longest to shortest, I want to change another way that you are probably looking at your test. I want you to categorize how you are going to interpret the tests that you run. And simply put, how do you categorize your test based by what you are testing for and the interpretation of those tests? Now, I'm going to admit, I look at my tests for what they're for a little bit differently than probably the normal way that most normal people think about testing. But that's how my mind works. And I am going to invite you inside my mind today. It's a lovely tour. Anyway, there is no gift shop, so let's just keep on walking. I categorize my test based on these categories. First one is base water, concentrated water, and product contribution. And then finally, just system signs. What's going on? What's telling me that's what's going on in the system. So base water, well, this is the makeup water. This is my starting point. This is what I need to know, where I'm starting and what to expect. Now, how do I interpret my concentrated water? And by the way, my concentrated water is my system water. That's my cooling tower, my boiler water, my loop water, whatever it is. If I don't have a base starting point, how am I ever going to compare that concentrated water? And I say that because I have the privilege of working with other companies, and they'll have me interpret their service reports, come in, do some training, see where there might be some holes in their organization. And one of the things that I notice more often than not is people are not running makeup water. So, this is the water that's coming into the system from the city or wherever that water supply is. And if you don't run it and that's your starting point, how do you know how to interpret your concentrated water? Well, what are we concentrating? We're concentrating the makeup water. And if we don't have a starting point for that, why are we even running some of these tests? And I will ask people that. Why are you running this test? Because there's no way you can interpret it properly. And they will say, well, I was told to run this test. Folks, if you don't know why you're running a test, please ask questions because there is gold in those answers. And when you understand everything that you're doing and the why behind it, this job just opens up and starts singing all this stuff that you can do and actually affect as an industrial water treater. So please ask questions. So with the base water, that's where I get my baseline on everything that's going to concentrate. And like I said, the concentrated water, things like the cooling tower, boiler, closed loop. Now, I might test things, and this might be different from you. I'm just going to list a couple. Maybe it's hardness, alkalinity, pH, conductivity, silica, maybe chlorides, and iron and copper, to name a few. Now, with the exception of pH and conductivity, the numbers that I get from these base water samples are going to be the denominator, that means the bottom number, in all the equations that I'm going to run. And these are easy equations. It is the concentrated water divided by the base water. So the concentrated water, the number that goes on top, we call that the numerator. So let's look at an example. Let's say I tested 100 parts per million of hardness in the makeup. That's my base. and 1,000 in the cooling tower. That's my concentrated sample. So 1,000 divided by 100, I have concentrated that makeup water 10 times in the cooling tower. And folks, you should be running equations like this on all the things that I just listed. So that way you know if you're properly concentrating those up. So all of our tests or all of the things we write down in our service report don't necessarily come out of our test kit. We also have to use a calculator as well. So this tells us that we have concentrated up the hardness in the makeup 10 times in our concentrated or cooling tower water. So what does this mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything yet because I don't have anything else to compare it to. So now let's talk about how I'm going to compare it. So I need to now test a non scaling ion to answer that question. This is why you would test chlorides. Chlorides are a non scaling ion. And if your company is like my company, we use sodium hypochlorite, which means we can't use chlorides for this. Now, if you're not using sodium hypochlorite, yeah, absolutely. Use chlorides to figure out what your true concentration number is. And if you're not using sodium hypochlorite, you can do that. But the reason you can't use it if you are using sodium hypochlorite, well, I will say it slowly, sodium hypochlorite. Okay, well, that implies chloride, and that will add to our chlorides, which will create problems. So, what do you do if you're in the same boat like I am and we're using sodium hypochlorite? Well, we find another non scaling ion that we can use. And in our case, we use silica. Now, I know what you're saying. Trace, silica is not a non scaling ion. And you said we needed to use a non scaling ion. Well, I did. And silica starts to scale at 150 parts per million. So if your makeup water is anywhere near 150 parts per million, you are right. You cannot use silica, and you need to find something else to determine what your true concentration is. Now, if your silica is like what it is here in Atlanta, which is around 3 to 6 parts per million, hey, in a regular cooling tower system, we are not going to get close to 150 parts per million. So we can use that. And that's how we set what that true concentration is in our makeup water. So for this example, let's say that our makeup water has 50 ppm of silica. Okay, well, we're not going to be able to use silica as this. And as I said before, you're going to have to find something else to test to do what we're doing in this example. Now, let me define a little bit more that true concentration. Now, this is a very loose term. I think I'm the only one that uses it, but this is just a term that I use to train with that gives me the actual base that I'm going to use as that denominator number when I'm running those equations from my makeup compared to my concentrated system water. So in our example here, let's say the silica I tested was 5 ppm in the makeup water, that's my base water, and it was 50 ppm in the concentrated or cooling tower water. So here's my equation, 50 divided by 5. Okay, well, that's my concentration level of 10. So there we go. That's going to be my base true concentration. And now I can compare all the other tests to that. So that's telling me that my silica has concentrated up 10 times my true concentration from that it started out with in the makeup water. And if I look at the previous sample that I had with hardness, and we said that we concentrated up 10 times, okay, well, those things are equal. They match. That tells me that I am carrying all the hardness that I started out with in the raw water into the concentrated water. So that tells me, okay, everything seems to be going okay. No alerts, no flags are going up, no bells are going off. Probably not going to do anything else. I'm just going to continue my test to see what else I can find. But let's just say we had some different numbers. Let's say the silica math said that I had a 12 concentration. So that means my base water concentrated up 12 times, but I only concentrated my hardness 10 times. All right, so what's going on there? Well, that's telling me I have less concentration than I should with my hardness in the concentrated water in my cooling tower. And it's telling me I have lost two concentrations worth of hardness in that water. Now, it's important that we realize our water is only going to test what is dissolved in the water. So, where did it go? Well, it precipitated out of the water and now it's residing in the system as scale. So, that is one of the ways that we can determine that we are not carrying all the hardness in this case, or whatever it is, if we were testing something else, and we're laying it down somewhere in the system. And we better figure out why. And this is why we're industrial water treaters, because our tests told us something. Our tests don't do anything for us, but confirm our hypothesis. Well, I didn't have a hypothesis that I was scaling the system, but now my test is saying, hey, you better look into that. So I need to go figure out what's going on. Now, let's look at the other side of that. Let's say I've concentrated silica 10 times, but my hardness is now 12. So somewhere I've pulled out two concentrations of hardness from the system. It didn't come from the makeup water. Well, where is that coming from? Well, I dissolved that from the system and now it's dissolved in the water, which means I can test for it. So a loose interpretation of this is I'm now cleaning up things in the system. Now, this is great news, say, if we just took over an account. We've been working on it for a while. We've changed the chemistries. We understand the system maybe a little bit better than who was there previously. And this could be evidence that we are cleaning up a fouled system, a scaled system. So this is a good thing. There might be something else going on. We need to figure out whatever that is telling us. But on short look at this, this is telling us that, hey, we're cleaning the system up. And if we have evidence that it was neglected previously, that's probably all that we need to know. Now, I know that there are people out there that are saying, Trace, you can't get a true sample of concentration water by a one-time sample of makeup water. That's just crazy. And you're right. The concentration water is going to change over days. Normally, it doesn't change very much, but I will give that to you. Yes, it will change. It won't be exactly the same. And it's not the same over those days. So it's not just that one sample. Right now, it's the composite sample that we're getting in our concentrated water over a couple days. But here's what I've learned in all my years of water treatment. Now I'm starting to become an old guy. I can say things like that. It's close enough. It's close enough because our tests are just telling us what we need to do next. And it's either confirming or disproving our hypothesis. So, because of that, because we have to interpret our test, I say it's good enough because we now have to investigate what to do next. And that's why I love James McDonald's character, Detective H2O, because you really do need to be a detective to determine what is going on in the system. The equipment knows, but it cannot talk. We've got to do all this investigation work to figure out what the equipment knows, but won't give up that information. We've got to figure out ways to make it talk. Now, we're going to do the same exact thing with all the other things that I mentioned that we tested, like alkalinity. Now, you need to know that you will lose some alkalinity as the water crosses the cooling tower. So that's just a phenomena that happens. Just realize that that's going to happen. And why would you even look to test concentration ratios of alkalinity knowing that? Well, what is scale? It's calcium carbonate. Well, calcium, that's why we test hardness, and carbonate, that's our alkalinity. So those are the building blocks of scale. That's why I always like to look at those. I want to make sure that those are staying in the system so we can confirm what we think is happening with the system, but we also know what are some bad things that could happen with the system. And our tests are going to make sure we don't tread into that category. Now, iron and copper, I'm going to wait on talking about for just another couple moments, but we will run concentration values on those too. Just give me a second to try to piece everything together. Now, the pH and conductivity we talked about, you can't really concentrate those, but you need to know those because I'm willing to bet you have product set points that are tied to those. And your product data sheets probably say that this product is good between these pHs. This is the conductivity. So you need to know those things. I always look at conductivity as the sum of the parts. And one of the first things I do when I run my test, I tell you run the longest test first. I kind of lied on that. I'll run conductivity first because if I get a conductivity in my concentrated water of 100, I'm probably not going to be running a lot of tests. I'm going to be figuring out where the leak is because my makeup water is 100 too. So by understanding interpretation of your tests, we may not even have to run some of the tests because if I spend an hour running tests and there's a leak in the cooling tower, why did I do that? Doesn't make any sense. I need to spend my time either fixing or getting somebody to fix the cooling tower so I can then fix the problem so it can concentrate back up properly. So understand why and when you are running your tests. Next, we're going to look at the tests for product contribution. So these are all the things that we add into the system that come from our product. That can be things like PTSA, it could be molybdate, polymer, phosphate. By the way, an earlier episode that I talked a lot about phosphate was episode 46. So if you want to learn more about phosphate, listen to episode 46. For our intents and purposes, we're just going to call it phosphate today because it's about the test, not the actual species. And we're going to look at all of these types of tests as what are we putting into the system? And they're all residual. What that means is we put them into the system and they go to work within the system. And when they're working on the system, like they're connected to a piece of pipe and inhibiting corrosion, they're not in the system water. And what do we know about our test? We can only test what is in the system, what is dissolved in the water. So whatever we test here, that is what is available as extra residual, with the exception of PTSA. PTSA is a tracer, and that's just there to say this is how much product you put in. And based on this much product, you should know from your data sheet how much you should have of particular items. This is important to know because as you test, you should be able to see those in your system from your information on your product data sheet. Now, for our example, we're going to test for phosphate. So, whatever our test result is, that means what is left over after the phosphate that's doing the work has attached itself to the system. And remember, I can only test for what is dissolved in the water, not what is doing work in the system. So, all of these residual readings are there to tell us that we have enough or not enough to replace when whatever's there doing the work in the system can no longer do that work in the system. And now we have this extra residual to come along and take its place and do that work. Again, all this information should be on your product data sheets. So we have that information. So now let's talk about that iron and copper that I mentioned earlier. I like to look at these as signs of what is going on in our systems. As I said before, we're still going to see how many times these things have concentrated based on our makeup water, our base water. And honestly, they should be equal to that concentration. If they come back higher, that's an indicated that we have a higher than wanted corrosion rate in the system. Now, if they come back lower, they might be getting bound up with something else. Now, we don't know what that something else is. Maybe it's scale. Now, it could be polymer in the system as well. We don't know, which is why we need to interpret our tests properly. And we may have to run other tests. We may have to talk to people. We may have to take other samples within the system just to see if we can get some more data. Because again, we're trying to put our detective hat on to figure out what is going on. So this implies we have regular tests that we do at every account, and then we have some extra tests that we're probably going to do to try to figure out what is going on with the system. So let's look at some higher level interpretations of our tests based on what we just said. Let's say I start off seeing a lower than expected hardness level. So I expected it to be 10 and it came back 8. Or I think in our case, we said 12 and it came back 10. So now I'm going to test polymer. A lot of us can test polymer in our test kit. Maybe you have something else that you can test that's within your system, and you find it's lower than what you anticipated. Well, I can anticipate that seeing what has pumped over the last so many days, that I should have a higher level with that. I look at water meter readings. Maybe I've got some meters on my pump. I can figure out how much is actually pumped. I can look at my data sheet. I can say, nope, I should really have more polymer in there. Or another way to do that is if I have PTSA in there, I'm testing for a specific amount of PTSA, and then I look at how much polymer or whatever I'm testing from that, and it should be higher than what it actually is. So where did it go? Well, most likely it went to help with that lost hardness. Now, if I'm losing some iron, so if the iron should be higher than I see, or maybe the iron is high in the system, and I'll check my polymer out, most likely that polymer is going to be low for the same reason. It's going to try to help with that upset. Now, if I didn't know how to interpret my tests, I wouldn't know what to do next. In this case, I would most likely turn up my inhibitor feed to compensate for the lost polymer. Ideally, what I would do is figure out what I needed, create a slug dose in the system, and put that directly in the system. Now, what I do really depends on if this is an isolated problem or if this is an ongoing problem. So again, I've got to put on that detective hat. Now, today, for the sake of time, let's just say we talked about the cooling tower, and that's all we're going to talk about today. And it was a one-time problem, and we just need to get the system back up to where it needs to go. So that would be the solve for this, or at least what we think is the solve. How are we going to confirm that it's solved? Well, we're going to have to come back. We're going to have to retest at the next time, whatever that interval is, and we should see things back at the right level. Now, keep in mind, I've seen a lot of people that simply turn up the pump and walk away. I mentioned a slug dose. If you don't know what that is, that's where you measure out the appropriate amount of product that needs to go in the entire system volume. You administer that into the system volume, and that gets it back up to where it can be maintained. Now, your current setting on the pump may be perfectly fine to maintain this. Now, if it keeps going on with the upset, you might have to increase that. But so many people chase their tails on pump settings because they never get the product dose up to where it should be maintained. They try to do that with the pump instead of actually doing that in the way I described. And the pump's just not meant to do that. The pump is, and the controller is meant to maintain what is already there. So maybe that is solving a problem that you're dealing with now, but it's all based on interpreting our tests correctly. So once again, if you're keeping score, I like to divide my categories up as the base water, that's our makeup water, the concentrated water. In today's examples, they were cooling towers, but they could be closed loop boilers, whatever you're testing. The product contribution, so what are we actually putting into the system that's from our product? And then what are some signs that our tests are telling us about what's happening within the system? That's where we talked about the copper and the iron. So my hope is that by looking at the system and the way that I look at the system and the testing is it's going to not only help you with your test, it's going to help you with the interpretation of those tests. And who cares about running tests? As my dad said, you're not going to make any money running tests. You're only going to confirm or disprove what you think is going on in the system. And then you can use that as evidence why they need the new controller, why they need the new pump, why you got to change them from product A to product B. And that's where you're increasing the relationship. So it's not sales for sales sake. It's sales for upgrading the performance of the system. How do we make this account better each and every time that we're there? And know that we can only do so much. We need to bring some of the better equipment that we have available here today. Maybe not the 1980s controller that we're having to deal with. That thing is so limited. We could do so much more if we upgrade to something that can maybe do remote monitoring and tell us what the product levels are in all of the tanks that are below it and let us know if pumps are primed or not. Keep track of all of the water meter readings. All of these things we can now do with today's automation. But if we don't have that available to us, we've got to do that manually, which means we're spending more time on things that are probably less important for somebody of your stature to take care of. That's not why they hired you. They hired you to make your system. I'm sorry, it's your system because you're taking care of it, but it's their system and they want you to make it better. They just need help on what they need to do. And now that we can interpret our tests better, we can give them better advice towards this. I'm willing to bet you've never thought about your test in this way before. And as I like to do, I like to look for different ways of looking at things that just self explain when I teach other people about this amazing industry. So I hope this was helpful for you. Some additional tips I can give you with your test kit is know your procedures. We all know if we've got to take time and read our procedures, you are taking too long to run your tests. What did my dad say about that? Exactly. You should be spending your time with your customers, not with your test kit. If you need some alone time with your test kit, do it at night at home. But when you're on site, you need to spend most of your time with your customer. Now, this includes knowing the times it takes to run all of your tests. And as I said in the top end of the show, run the longest test first, with the exception of your conductivity. And then your quicker ones you can run while those longer ones are developing. So just think, if just changing that one thing and you're not waiting on your tests anymore, gives you an additional 5 minutes at that account. So you save 5 minutes at that account and you repeat that 4 times a day because you service 4 accounts. Well, folks, that's almost an extra 2 hours a week. That's some real time. That's time we could spend with our customers. That's time we could spend finding new customers. That's time you can, of course, you're already listening to the Scaling Up H2O podcast on your way driving from account to account. So that's a great way to save time. But folks, when you challenge the way you do things and you understand them better, that's how you get time back. So I really hope that you dig into those procedures because that's where that time is. While you're there, also look into knowing your interferences. Now, interferences are what we call when there's something in the water that's going to interfere with what you are testing with. And normally, the remedy to that is dilution. So a lot of times iron is going to be an interferer. So if I'm in a system with high iron, I might just know that I've got to start my sample with a dilution because it's not going to be a valid sample. Now, isn't that inconvenient when you do a long test and you find out that you didn't run it right? Now, true, you can dilute it on the back end. It's always good to dilute it on the front end. You get a better, crisper number, but I will tell you, I've run it both ways and it's not that much different. I will say, with the caveat, depending on which test. So now you've got to dilute it. And there is a difference with diluting. If you're diluting because it's over range, you can do it on the back end. If you're diluting because there's an interference in there, you really can't do that on the back end. So I'm going to correct what I just said. So if we know there's an interference there, we're probably going to bring our DI bottle out. We're going to run that. We just save time knowing our procedures because we know our interferences. So that tells us that we know the test better. I really like to encourage people to go into the water analysis handbook that I mentioned earlier, look up the test that you were running, and it will actually tell you what the chemistry is that allows that test to function. Now, maybe you don't know all those things now, and maybe you read some of those things and it still doesn't make sense to you. But by trying to learn some of that, the interferences will start to make more sense, especially when you have the same interference on different tests. Now you're starting to learn how different tests act kind of similarly. You'll be able to interpret when there could be potential issues. And hopefully, you have a mentor. You now have some more information that you can ask your mentor about. And when you understand the tools that you are using, folks, that is when this industry just opens up and you're not spending time just staring into your test kit. You are staring at all of the wonderful world of water treatment and just using your tests as a tool. I want to underscore that. Your tests are a tool for you to use for interpretation. Your tests are not your master. And when you learn to master your tests, that opens up a whole new world in the world of water treatment. Nation, as I mentioned earlier in the show, this episode was made totally possible by about a dozen questions from members of the Scaling Up Nation that asked me questions. And I said, you know what? I think I can make a show out of this and hopefully make a coherent storyline where you're now learning along with them getting answers to their questions. So I want to thank you once again. Thank you for those questions. And if you have a question, don't keep that to yourself. Go to scalinguph2o.com, go over to our show ideas page, and let me know what that question is. Now, there's also a way to record your voice if you want me to potentially play your voice back on the air and answer your question. We do that sometimes. Maybe you have a show topic that you want to hear. Maybe there's a potential guest that you want me to interview. Anything you have that can help us with the show, we want to hear about that. And again, that's scalinguph2o.com. Go over to our show ideas page. And I will tell you, somebody that has more ideas about water treatment and how he can make it fun and how he can challenge us each and every week is our friend James McDonald. And here's a brand new Drop by Drop with James.
Welcome to Drop by Drop with James, the podcast segment where we wonder, explore, think about, imagine, and learn industrial water treatment, you guessed it, drop by drop, together. In today's episode, let's picture in your mind a boiler that is open for inspection. As you stand in front of it, you may see the handholds and manholes open up. The room may be much quieter than normal because the burners and air blowers aren't running. It may be a fire tube or water tube boiler. The inspection will be different between the two, with several commonalities as well. Before you start your inspection, what should you do? Have you spoken to the operators in the area? Have you followed proper safety protocols for confined space entry, lockout, tagout, etc.? Do you feel safe entering the boiler? Do you know the history of the boiler before going in? Does this history of water treatment and boiler performance allow you to predict what you will see inside the boiler? How will you document what you find? How will you collect any samples if necessary? How dirty will you get? Do you know the equipment you will see inside the boiler, such as steam water separators, baffle plates, downcomers, feed water piping, etc.? What do you expect the water line to look like? Where will oxygen pitting and hard water scaling first show up in the boiler if there's a problem? Will you be inspecting the deaerator as well? How long will it take for you to get the boiler inspection report to your client? Doing a proper boiler inspection takes time, experience, knowledge, attention to detail, and often agility. I'm James McDonald, and I want to encourage you to be like water by forming bonds with those around you, dissolving new knowledge, and making worthy ripples, drop by drop.
I love this picture, the boiler exercise. Using your mind's eye allows you to practice before you are even there. Picture yourself in that mechanical room, close your eyes and do all of the things in your mind's eye that you're going to do there. And through that mental practice, you're going to discover that you're going to need a tool that you almost forgot to bring. Maybe you're going to need some sample collection bags or bottles. Oh my goodness, I almost forgot those. Well, earlier we were talking about saving 2 hours a week just by saving 5 minutes on each account if we were doing 4 a day. Well, folks, imagine if you had to drive back to your home when you were doing this boiler inspection because you forgot something that you absolutely positively needed. You might just save 2 hours just in this one exercise. And your mind can't tell the difference with you not being there. It just thinks that you've done it before. So now when you get there, it's the second time that you've done it. One of my favorite stories around this is about Major James Nesmith. And he was a golfer, and he would golf. And he had a hometown court that he would golf on. And he was a POW of Vietnam. And he was held in a 4x4 cage for a really long amount of time. And he saw a lot of the other POWs just lose their minds. And he did not. He didn't enjoy it by any means. But when he was asked, how did he hold himself together? He said he played golf every day. Now, obviously, his captors would not let him out to play golf. He mentally played golf. He went back to that hometown golf course and he played 18 holes each and every day in his mind. Now, when he was liberated and healthy enough to go play golf, he played that very course. And he shot the best game that he ever shot in his life on that returning visit. And that is proof that your mind cannot tell the difference, that you did not do that before. James, I love all of these that you do, but I got to say, I really, really love this one. And Nation, I hope you don't only take advantage of this one. If you haven't kept up, boy, do we have a surprise for you. We've got all of these on Scaling Up H2O. And if you need to catch up, just simply go to scalinguph2o.com and we've got them all listed out for you. And you can catch up with Drop by Drop with James. Now, James is a permanent fixture on this show, so he's going to be bringing us something new next year. So you have to stay tuned for the next couple weeks to learn what that is. But James, we sure appreciate what you do. Nation, I sure appreciate what you do by letting me know what you want to hear. And of course, by tuning in to listen to this episode and every episode that you listen to. I'm going to have a brand new one for you next week. Until then, learn your test kit. Remember, your test kit is your tool, and you are the master of that tool. Have a great week, folks. Preparing for the CWT exam can be daunting, but our Certified Water Technologist Prep course makes it easier. With valuable study tools and a 100-question practice exam, you'll be ready to tackle that test with confidence. Visit scalinguph2o.com/CWT prep to sign up today.